Hi there and welcome to this video lecture on Buddhism. And in this lecture I'm going to talk about the three marks of existence primarily. And these are dukkha, or suffering, or really dissatisfaction, dependent origination, which is a theory of causation, and no self, the idea of Buddhist idea that we're not selves in the way that we think we are. So these are called the three marks of existence. So I'm going to go over them and talk about the contribution they make to Buddhist philosophy, and to look at the way they sort of interact and work together to develop a sort of comprehensive worldview. So I'm going to talk about these three ideas in this lecture. Okay, so one of the most famous ideas associated with Buddhism, one of the first pronunciations of the Buddha, was the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths tell us that first, we're in a state of suffering. We're in an ongoing state of dissatisfaction. So to talk about suffering, it's not really saying that we're sort of constantly in pain, sort of, constantly suffering in that sort of sense, but more like a sense of dissatisfaction with the way things are, an ongoing dissatisfaction with experience. And of course, Buddhism starts from that dissatisfaction and tells us how to address and to overcome that sense of dissatisfaction. So the focus of Buddhism is very much a kind of ethical focus, because it focuses on a problem of life, a problem of our existence, which is the fact of dukkha, or suffering, and it gives us a way of working against that state of dissatisfaction and finding solutions to that state. So the second truth is the truth of the origin of suffering, that suffering arises from causes and conditions. And there we'll see there's a link to dependent arising, and sort of the idea of causality, so that's something to pursue. And the third truth announces the truth of cessation. There's a possibility of reaching a state where dissatisfaction and suffering has ceased. So there's a possibility of reaching a condition where we've sort of ceased to suffer, where suffering, dissatisfaction is no longer has a place. And number 4 tells us the path to reach that state, typically the kind of mental and sort of physical attributes that we need in order to sort of follow that path, which Buddhism calls the Eightfold Path, towards the sort of release from suffering. So what causes dukkha? The Buddhist tradition tells us dukkha, suffering, is caused by craving. And craving itself is caused by the failure to understand the three marks of existence, which we've just seen are dukkha, dependent origination, and no self. So craving is caused by this failure to really understand, not just cognitively, but to sort of embody in our existence, embody in our being, this understanding of the three marks of existence. So things are unsatisfactory because they are impermanent. They don't last. They don't give us the satisfaction that we think or we expect from things. And things are impermanent because they lack a self or essence. And that's the idea of no self. And as we'll see, that lack of essence also applies to all of us as selves. All of us as selves lack an essence, just like everything else in the universe. Sometimes the Buddhist tradition historically has put this by saying that the self is empty, and things are empty. And this expresses this idea of a sort of lack of a persisting essence to things. Things are simply impermanent and subject to change and transformation depending on how they interact with other things. So suffering, this sense of dissatisfaction, is linked to our minds. It's not primarily a physical process. There are physical truths and sort of physical changes that we all undergo, right? We all get old, we all become sick, and we all kind of suffer in these physical ways. But the primary thing is how we react and respond to this suffering. And the primary thing is we suffer because we live with wrong ideas about what things are like and what the world is like. So ending suffering means changing the way we understand the world and changing our place in it. So it's the ideas that we have about what things are supposed to be like, about things are supposed to be. We want to sort of grasp onto things and have them permanently with us. But we know that's not possible because things change and things decay, things degenerate and undergo a constant process of transformation. So our expectations about things, our expectations about how things are, is the thing that primarily causes us to suffer. So we could identify three kinds of dukkha, or three kinds of sort of dissatisfaction. There's suffering as a kind of physical or mental pain. Our joints hurt, or we have a headache, or we're mentally anguished about something. And secondly, there's dukkha as the idea of change. That everything in the world is changing from moment to moment. Everything changes, everything is impermanent. So things that once pleased us no longer do, or they no longer please us in the same sense. And the third is dukkha as conditions. Since the world is a place of shifting and unstable conditions and constant change, we can never feel entirely at ease in it. So any one of these, or a combination of these things, may be the sort of contributing to dukkha or suffering at any moment. So craving literally means a thirst, or a kind of, originally etymologically, it means a kind of unquenchable thirst, and that's the main condition for the arising of suffering, that we sort of crave things and want to possess them, and want to sort of keep them with us. So one of the things that we crave are the objects of the senses. So pleasure based on objects of the senses tends to be unsatisfactory because of the unreliable and unstable nature of such objects. The promise they offer is it's kind of illusory, right? It's not a sort of permanent happiness or a permanent satisfaction. It's maybe a temporary thing based on how we see them, based on our perspective. So craving is never content with what it has, but it's always looking for new objects to satisfy itself as well. So we get bored of the things that we crave, and we're always looking for new cravings. So the objects of the senses, they attract us, but they never ultimately satisfy us. The second is craving for existence, which is craving to be a particular kind of person, craving for fame or reputation. And of course, this is all bound up with the idea of ego, of wanting to see ourselves in a certain way, of wanting to see ourselves in a certain light. So one of the fundamental things that we crave is to be seen as a particular kind of person, to have a self that's perceived in certain ways, to have a self that has a reputation, that has a self that's well regarded. This is an important craving. And as we'll see, the issue here is that if we're not actually selves in the sense that we take us to be, in other words, if we don't have this kind of permanent essence that persists, then the craving for existence is ultimately going to be, it's going to be disappointed, right? We're never going to be able to sustain the kind of self that we think we deserve, that we think we desire, that we think we're entitled to. So craving, again, is another thing that leads us to craving for existence. To be a self of a particular kind is a thing that's, again, going to lead us towards dissatisfaction. And the third And final thing, the craving for non-existence. Here it's not like we're trying to kind of build up our ego, but it's almost like we're trying to sort of crush it and make it as small as possible. So here we want to sort of do away with our ego. We want to sort of almost disappear. And this can manifest as harsh self-criticism, sometimes eating disorders, personality disorders, where we're kind of very harsh and critical with ourselves and sort of very sort of severe with our bodies. So this is typical of the craving for non-existence. We want to deny the self and make it disappear. So craving ultimately gives way to clinging. As a result of craving, then we grasp at things and try to take possession of them in order to make them our own. So it's not sense objects that cause us suffering per se, it's not the objects themselves, it's the way that we cling to those objects as a result of craving. We want to make them our own and we want to sort of permanently possess them. But of course that's impossible, given the impermanence of existence. So the way that we sort of grasp and then cling at things is the thing that causes suffering. So craving is based, we can say, on a fundamental misjudgment of the situation. We assume that when we get what we want, we'll be happy. So it relies on the misapprehension that lasting happiness is related to our ability to have, to possess, and to take hold of the experiences we like, and of course to push away, to get rid of the experiences we don't like. Now, such a judgment, being able to do that, assumes a world in which things are permanent, unchanging, stable, and reliable. But of course, the world is not like that. So because things are not like that, we're always going to be subject to this process of change and impermanence. The things we possess will no longer satisfy us in the same way, and we'll desire other things, but they will no longer satisfy us after a certain time. So that the impermanence and the changing nature of reality undermines our ability to take possession of things and to sort of reliably have the experiences that we think we want to get out when we want to be happy. So we have to accept that the world is one in which we're just going to experience a sort of mix of emotions, a changing sort of a changing series of emotions and experiences, which will run from happy to unhappy to disappointed and so on. But that's just the nature of experience, and there's nothing we can't grasp onto things to stop that from happening. So craving is based on a fundamental ignorance and misunderstanding of the nature of the world, particularly about the sort of impermanence of things. And we're going to discuss that now with the idea of dependent origination. So the simplest expression for this in the Buddhist tradition is this phrase: thus when this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. So this is just a statement of causation. Something arises that makes something else happen. Something exists, and so something else doesn't come to be. Something stops, and something else stops as a result. So causation, dependence. Things are dependent on other things. They're not self-sustaining. They don't sustain themselves. They depend on other things in order to come into existence and in order to remain in existence. So basically, everything which comes into being originates in dependence on something else. Every event has a cause. All things arise as part of a causal series, so nothing exists independently and in itself. So the universe itself, we can say, is not a collection of static objects, which is sometimes how it appears to us in our everyday experience, but a dynamic network of interrelated causes and effects, things which happen because they're dependent on other things and give way to other things. So the interrelatedness and the sort of what we can call the processual nature of reality, the reality as process. It's a dynamic network of causes and effects, not a collection of static objects. So the mainstream Buddhist interpretation of this idea is that there are no individual things as causes and effects that are independent or self-contained beings. So we could say here again that nothing possesses its own essence within itself. Things are caused to be by other things. Right? Nothing is self-sustaining, sort of brings itself into existence. Things are brought into existence by their relations to other things that serve as causes or effects. So what there is then are processes or happenings which are themselves connected to all other processes in a continuous flux and flow of events. Things are not things, we might say, but events in a giant causal network with loads of interconnections. So let's have a look at the basic account, the basic features of the Buddhist account of causation. There are not any metaphysically distinct and independently existing things, first of all. Right? So things are a result of processes of coming to be from other things, causation. So nothing exists independently without being brought to arise or brought into existence by its relation to other things. Secondly, everything that exists as processes or events that are the results of causal interactions that have given rise to them. And as we'll see, that applies to human beings as well. Us, humans ourselves, we are also processes that are the results of causal interactions that have given rise to us. So thirdly, all things are impermanent because they are constantly changing, entering into new causal interactions. Nothing stays the same, nothing stays the way it is. Things interact and constantly change. And perhaps the most important feature of this account is that because things are constantly changing, they lack an enduring self or essence, what Buddhism calls svabhava. So that idea of a self or essence is an important idea, and we'll see how it applies to us as selves shortly. So the idea is, because we're constantly changing, there's nothing permanent underlying the changes. So there's just this process of change. Now here Buddhism takes itself to be articulating a middle way, in other words, a sort of middle path, a compromise path between eternalism and annihilationism. Let me explain these things. Eternalism is the idea that something unchanging persists through all of the changes. So, for example, the belief in the permanent self, or the Atman, which was part of Indian philosophy. The idea is that the Atman persists despite how we change as selves through our lifetime. We undergo physical, mental, emotional changes, but the Atman stays the same. The Atman is permanent. It accompanies us through our lives. People sometimes think of the soul in that way as well, something that's with us, that persists, that doesn't change. So any perspective like that is called eternalism. Now, annihilationism is the opposite and says that there is nothing in common between a thing at one time and at another time. So there's simply no commonality. There's nothing that sort of links together something happening at one time and the same thing, at a sort of future time. There's nothing in common whatsoever. They're just different things. Right, so we've either got the idea of eternalism, a kind of persisting permanent essence, or we've got annihilationism, the idea that there's no connection. There's just a thing at one time and a thing at another, and they have nothing in common. Buddhism, as we know, says that reality is a process. things are causally connected through time, but there is no underlying permanent thing that persists through the changes. So Buddhism would deny eternalism and say there's nothing permanent, there's no permanent thing that persists through the changes. But it would also criticize annihilationism because it would say what things have in common is precisely this causal connection through time. They're connected through the series of events. And that's what we think of, that's what gives us our identity, and it's what gives things their identity, the causal connection through time. So in the early writings, there's an example of the lamp to illustrate this idea. And it's supposed to illustrate how we can think of ourselves as a self without having anything permanent that's sort of subsisting, anything permanent that exists through the changes, right? There's no essence, there's nothing that's permanent through the changes, but how can we be the same thing then over time if there's nothing that's the same? So Buddhism gives us this example, right? So a flame is kept alight all night by lighting one lamp with another. So an oil lamp runs for a couple of hours. So when the lamp runs down, using that flame, another lamp is lit with the same flame. So there's a continuity. There's a kind of continuity because one flame is giving light to the other flame, which is giving light to the next flame. So the flame continues throughout the night, but there's nothing permanent underlying the continuity. The connection is just the causal series. So this is a suggestion of how we think about our own identity, say the identity of the self. So there's nothing permanent underlying the changes, but there's a causal series, and it's the continuity of that causal series that at one time we did this, then we did that, then we did this, and that led us there. It's that continuity of that causal series that gives us that sense of identity through time. So neither eternalism nor annihilationism, but a kind of continuity without permanence is the best description of the Buddhist account. So each element of dukkha that we saw in the beginning of this lecture specified in the first noble truth is actually a process or event, not a thing with a fixed, unchanging essence. So the things that are sort of associated with suffering, being sick, aging, dying, experiencing pain and despair, are all what we can think of as dynamic happenings, experienced as fleeting and transitory states. So they're not things, but things that happen processually, things we undergo as a process, dynamic happenings that are sort of so this is sort of how we should think of our experience of suffering. So suffering is also often existential suffering, despair, anguish, worry, concern, anxiety, things we might call sort of mental health, mental suffering. So this kind of suffering relies on the assumption that there is a me to serve as a potential bearer of meaning and significance. So an important idea in Buddhism is that we suffer because the kind of meaning and value we want is not to be had. There's no permanent self to sustain it. So letting go of the notion of the self frees us from these kinds of suffering. Once we let go, we no longer expect or sort of require that kind of meaning and value to be there. And we can let go of those kinds of expectations. So by self, we're often sort of talking about the essence of a person, the one part whose continued existence is required for that person to continue to exist. The part would be what is named when we say I. So to say that there is no self is to say that nothing can play the role of securing the identity of the self over time. And we've seen that Buddhism wants to take issue with that idea of a permanent self over time and wants to question that idea. Now, it's helpful here, before we look at the self, to think about different types of identity and sort of identity of the self and how we sort of think about that. And there are two kind of possibilities. There's numerical identity and qualitative identity. So X and Y are numerically identical if they are one and the same thing. So it's one and the same object that we're calling X and Y. An example of this, people used to talk about the morning star and the evening star. So the morning star appears at a certain time in the sky. The evening star appears at a different place in the sky. I think they're both the same thing. I think it's the planet Venus that people used to call the morning star and the evening star, right? But it's the same thing. So that's numerical identity. We're using different words to refer to it, but what we're talking about is the same thing. X and Y are numerically identical if they are one and the same thing in one and the same place. X and Y are qualitatively identical if they share the same qualities, right? So we can have, say identical twins will share a lot of qualities, will have a lot of qualitative identity if they share a lot of traits, a lot of habits, and so on. But they're not numerically identical because they're not the same thing. They're two different things occupying two different parts of space. So they're qualitatively identical, but not numerically identical. So when we think about the self, we're thinking about numerical identity. It's something being one and the same thing over time. Okay, so the Buddhist view of the self revolves around this idea of the 5 skandhas. And the word skandha basically, it comes from a word meaning bundle, or a sort of bundle or collection of stuff, like a collection of stuff that you sort of gather and put in a bag. So we have 5 skandhas, 5 bundles, 5 collections of stuff. Okay, and these are the 5. There's rupa, which is anything corporeal or physical, and of course physical components are part of who we are. We have a kind of physical, a sort of an existence in physical space. Secondly, feeling. This is sensations of, not emotions, but sensations of pleasure, pain, and indifference. It's like our affective attunement to our experience. Sometimes it's kind of positive, sometimes a bit negative, sometimes indifferent, and that's the level of feeling. Perception involves a kind of cognition where we, through mental events, where we grasp the character of objects. So seeing an object as an object of a certain kind, as a sort of blue object that's used for this or the other. So perception is our ability to view objects as bearers of qualities. Volition is about action. It's the mental forces responsible for bodily and mental activity. And this could be things like hunger, anger, or attentiveness, things that sort of push us to action. And the final one is consciousness. So the awareness of our physical and mental states, the sort of awareness that we have of ourselves and our awareness of our experience. Now, Buddhism gives us 2 arguments why the skandhas cannot make up a self. In other words, we have these 5 skandhas, that's what makes us who we are as persons, but they don't make us into selves. In other words, they don't make us into this permanent, non-changing essence that persists over time. And the first reason is that they are impermanent. So we know that all cells in the body are replaced gradually over time. So there's nothing permanent about rupa, or our sort of physical constitution, because all cells are sort of changing, regenerating over time. All of the other skandhas originate dependently. In other words, they occur because of some other thing which is present. So the feeling of pleasure, for example, originates from sense contact with ice cream, When the context ceases, the pleasure ceases as well. New feelings of pleasure emerge with renewed sense contact. So the idea here is that the skandhas are just constantly changing based on the nature of experience. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes negative, sometimes this, sometimes that. But because they're constantly changing, there's nothing permanent about them that can ground this sense of our being a self. What about volitions? Some people say, something like fear can be it can be a constant sort of inhibiting thing. Does it last a lifetime? Can you sort of have that as the ground of your identity? But I think we could say, I only feel a desire to escape danger when in a threatening situation. So the desire itself originates again in a specific sense contact event. So it's not the kind of enduring volition that can make up the identity of the self. So even when we have emotions or volitions, things which seem to sort of be with us constantly, they're still responsive to the environment. They still arise in response to a particular sense contact event, something that leads it to come into existence. So it still can't be an enduring, permanent thing. The second argument is the controller argument. And the idea here is that if there was a self, it would be a controller. In other words, it would be able to sort of control the skandhas and sort of direct what they do. But we know that each of the skandhas is sometimes other than the way we want it to be. We sometimes feel what we don't want to feel, we see what we don't want to see, etc. There is nothing that performs the executive function, in this case, nothing that sort of directs the skandhas to see what we want to see. So in that sense, again, there's no self, there's no controller. According to mainstream Buddhism, then, what is the self, or what do the words self or I refer to? So according to mainstream Buddhism, the self is a convenient designator. So let me explain. This means that the self is not actually real. In other words, it's not a permanent essence, a permanent thing. It's only real in a conventional sense. To say something is real in a conventional sense means that it's convenient to use the term, but it doesn't actually refer to something permanent that sort of persists. So when Buddhists deny there is a permanent self, they are not saying there is nothing there. Okay, so this is where we come back to what we were talking about in the sort of the division between eternalism and annihilationism. Okay, so when Buddhism says there's no permanent self, there's nothing persisting underlying the changes, there's a temptation to revert to the annihilationist view, which says, well, in that case, there must be nothing there. Right? If there's no permanent self, then there's nothing. There's simply these things that change, and there's no continuity. So Buddhism says there is a kind of continuity, but it's conventional. It's not because there's a persisting essence. In other words, it's convenient to use the word self and to use the words I to describe the causal connections made up by each of us as living persons. Right? To describe the causal connections that I did this and that led me to do that. I did this and that meant that this happened. So when we use those causal connections, it helps us understand experience, and it's convenient to use those to be able to understand our experience. But there's no assumption that there is a permanent underlying self. It's simply a convenient way of referring to our experience. So this is the difference between ultimate and conventional truth. A statement is conventionally true if and only if it uses convenient designators and reliably leads to successful practice. So talking about a self can be successful because, we sort of brush our teeth in the morning, and that has sort of causal effects that we don't get We don't get tooth decay and our teeth don't get bad and stuff. And so we can think of ourselves as persisting through time. It's convenient, right? It leads to good practice, or it leads to successful practice, because we can link things that we've done with things that happen to us. But it's not ultimately true to say we have a self. And a statement is ultimately true if and only if it corresponds to the facts, and neither asserts nor presupposes the existence of any conceptual fictions. So in a sense, the self is a kind of fiction. We use it because it leads to, it's useful because it leads to a kind of successful practice of thinking of ourselves as existing through time, but it's not sort of a really permanently existing entity. So this is expressed in the dialogue of the story of Nagasena and King Milinda, and I posted the video in the module this week, the short YouTube video you can have a look at, which goes into the dialogue, generally dated around the 2nd century of the Common Era. So Nagasena's position. So Nagasena, in the dialogue with King Milinda, they start off by having this discussion where Nagasena denies being a self and says, "There's, where is Nagasena? There's no Nagasena." And Nagasena, who is a Buddhist monk, excuse me, his position is that Nagasena does not refer to a self. In other words, there's no Atman, there's no persisting essence. The name is just a temporary, convenient designation for the aggregates or the skandhas. So again, the Buddhist view that the name is just a convenient designation. Excuse me. Melinda's response, King Milinda responds, "If it is true that there is no Atman, then who is it that I am talking to? I am obviously talking to you, so your position must be false." So again, we get the idea with King Milinda that it's either eternalism, there's something permanent, or it's annihilationism, there's no one there. If there's no Nagasena, if there's nothing permanent, then I must be talking to no one. Right? There's nothing in common between the different sort of appearances of Nagasena. Excuse me. So one way of thinking about this, and in terms of sort of what a name refers to, is in terms, and the idea of a conventional identity, a conventional, existing in a conventional sense. Nagasena uses this example of a chariot and its parts. So if we look at all the parts, and we can sort of label every single part of the chariot, the wheel, the axle, the rod, the body, the hubs, whatever a chariot is made of. And after listing every single one of the parts, we can then ask the question, where is the chariot? The chariot is not one of its parts, nor is it in addition to the parts, but it seems to be the sum of its parts as an aggregate. And yet, if we take all of the parts of the chariot and we dismantle the chariot and we put all the parts lying on the ground next to one another, we still have all the parts, but we don't have a chariot. So the chariot is not just the sum of the parts. It's the sum of the parts organized and arranged in a certain way. But then you can ask the question, well, suppose I replace one of the wheels. Suppose one of the wheels breaks and I have to replace it. Is it still the same chariot? Is it still the same chariot I had, or is it a different one? So what makes something a chariot? What is it that we refer to when we talk about this chariot? And again, this is discussed in the video that I posted in the week 6 module. If we think about what makes something a chariot, it's simply a convenient way of referring to this arrangement of material things. Right? So we refer to this as a chariot and not the parts lying on the ground, because this is useful, right? It does something useful. It serves a purpose in sort of human life. It's a mode of transport. So we give a name to this, right? But the chariot itself is simply the collection of parts. So it's simply that the sum of parts and not itself an existing entity. So we can talk about how we relate to the skandhas in the same way. They're simply the collection of skandhas, and what we call a self is simply the name for the arrangement of those skandhas. So it's not a kind of underlying essence or a sort of persisting thing. It's just a convenient word that we use for a certain arrangement of parts that are causally connected in some way. So, to finish up on this idea of the middle way between eternalism and annihilationism, which is talked about in Gethin's article on page 145. So eternalism posits the idea of a constant self underlying experiences and persisting through them. And this is the position of classic Indian pre-Buddhist philosophy with the idea of the Atman, the sort of persisting permanent self. Annihilationism is the view that there is no real connection between a person at one point in time and another. Buddhism's view is that there is connection, but it's not that of an underlying essence. It's simply a causally connected series. And we saw that in the example of the lamps that are lit through the night. There's no sort of physical persistence. There's no essence that persists. It's simply the sort of persistence of the light and the persistence of the flame through the night. So it's a causal connection. It's a sort of causal continuity without underlying essence. So that's essential to understanding the view of Buddhism about the self.